All right, welcome in everyone. Buckle up because we have a wild ride ahead of us today. You've really outdone yourselves this time, sending in a truly fascinating mix of stuff to unpack. We've got everything from, like, the high-stakes world of global finance and the crypto markets to the bleeding edge of emerging tech. Oh, and even some seriously thought-provoking political stuff bubbling beneath the surface. So, our mission today, if we choose to accept it, is to cut through all the noise and help you make sense of what really matters. What are the key takeaways here? And what might they mean for, well, all of us as things continue to unfold?
Yeah, no kidding. It's a pretty broad landscape we're looking at, but, it's often at these intersections, these points where different trends and ideas collide that the most interesting patterns start to emerge. So, for our deep dive today, we're going to start by taking a look at how the crypto world, particularly Bitcoin, reacted to the latest announcement from the Federal Reserve.
Right, because that was quite the reaction.
It was. Then we'll go a little bit deeper and dig into some, I think, surprising details about the information that the Fed is actually using to make these really weighty decisions.
Because when you hear the Fed, you think, massive amounts of data and economists and models and, like, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. You'd think so, wouldn't you? But let's just say that the reality might be a little bit different than what you'd expect.
Okay, so let's start with that FOMC meeting that just wrapped up. The big news, as many people were anticipating, I think, was that the Federal Reserve has decided to keep interest rates right where they are. No change for now. Now, that decision itself wasn't necessarily a huge surprise, but its effect on the price of Bitcoin was pretty much instantaneous.
Yeah, absolutely. You could see Bitcoin basically take off, jumping from around, what was it, $83,000 to $86,000 almost as the news broke.
Wow, that's a pretty big jump.
It is. It really highlights just how closely the cryptocurrency market is watching and reacting to these pronouncements from central banks. Any sign and shift in the macroeconomic environment, and they're ready to move.
Yeah, it really illustrates that interconnectedness. But here's where things get maybe a little bit unsettling. It's not just the decision itself, but the rationale behind it. Chairman Powell specifically mentioned a survey indicating continued concerns about rising inflation. Now, when you hear that, you probably think they're looking at, a pretty comprehensive study, lots of data points, different sectors of the economy, all that stuff. Right?
Yeah, you'd think so. Given the gravity of the decisions they're making, you'd expect something pretty robust.
Right. Not just like asking their neighbors how much milk costs or whatever.
Well, about that, the information that we have indicates that this survey actually involved less than 100 households and businesses.
Wait a minute. Less than 100? For the entire U.S. economy?
That's what it seems like, yeah.
That's just mind-boggling. It's almost like trying to understand a whole forest by, like, looking at a single sapling.
Right.
It really makes you question whether their models are really capturing all the nuances of what's happening in the economy right now, or if they're relying on a pretty narrow view based on, well, not a lot of data.
Yeah, it definitely raises some really fundamental questions about the reliability and the representativeness of the data that's informing these massive monetary policy decisions. We're talking about trillions of dollars in play and decisions that affect millions of people. A sample size that small almost seems, well, statistically insignificant.
It makes you wonder what other data points might be getting more weight or less weight and why.
Exactly. And I think it naturally leads us to a broader conversation about the Federal Reserve itself, right? I mean, the very idea of a central bank operating within a capitalist system has been debated for, well, a very long time.
Yeah, it has. There's this ongoing discussion about whether central banks, with their power to manage the money supply and set interest rates, really fit into a truly free market system.
Right. And some economists, particularly those from the Austrian school, have argued that the idea of a central bank is actually more rooted in centrally planned economies than in laissez-faire systems. They view it as sort of anathema to free market principles.
And we see that reflected in figures like, Thomas Massie and Ron Paul, who've been very vocal for years about the need for more oversight of the Fed.
Right.
They've called for an audit or even, in some cases, the abolition of the Fed entirely.
Yeah, their argument basically boils down to the potential for monetary manipulation. And they argue that this manipulation doesn't necessarily benefit the average person. In fact, they say it can contribute to economic instability and wealth concentration.
Because their argument is that the Fed's interventions can distort market signals. They create these artificial booms and busts.
Yeah, and ultimately they lead to a decline in the purchasing power of the currency over time.
Right, it's that whole printing money argument.
Yeah.
So this perspective really challenges us to think differently about how monetary policy could be managed. Maybe there are alternative models out there that could lead to better outcomes, at least from their perspective.
Exactly. It makes you think about who the primary beneficiaries of the current system actually are. So it's a lot to consider.
It is. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the big picture stuff like central banking, but now let's zoom in on a specific project in the crypto world that's been making headlines. I'm talking about EOS. Now, for anyone who maybe wasn't around during the peak of the ICO boom, EOS was this project that generated a ton of hype.
Oh, yeah.
They raised a truly mind-blowing $4 billion in their ICO.
$4 billion, wow.
And it was being hailed by some as a potential Ethereum killer.
The next big thing.
Exactly. But now things are changing. They're rebranding, they're changing their name to Vaulta, and they're saying they're going to focus on Web3 banking. What's your take on this? What do you make of this evolution?
Well, it's a pretty significant shift, for sure. The rebranding to Vaulta is a clear signal that they're changing direction. They're saying they want to integrate blockchain technology and the core ideas of decentralization into traditional financial services, hence the Web3 banking label. And their focus, at least based on what they've said so far, is on more established financial applications like wealth management, consumer payments, even portfolio investment and insurance.
So it sounds like they're moving toward like a more mainstream, maybe even a more regulated financial environment.
It does seem that way. And the fact that they've brought on board people with experience at Binance and that they're talking about targeting institutional clients and, high net worth individuals definitely points in that direction.
Yeah, that's a far cry from the decentralized revolution rhetoric that was common during the ICO craze. But let's be honest, there's a lot of skepticism out there about this rebranding, and maybe even about EOS in general. Their history hasn't exactly been smooth sailing.
Yeah, no, you're right. After all that initial excitement and the massive ICO, EOS it underperformed, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and they even faced accusations of, not delivering on what they had promised.
Right. And then there's the whole issue of what they actually did with that $4 billion they raised. Reports are that they used a significant chunk of it to buy Bitcoin.
Which, that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for a lot of people, it just added to this narrative that maybe their priorities weren't quite aligned with what they were telling their investors.
Yeah, it certainly raised some eyebrows.
Okay, so let's talk about this banking advisory council that Vaulta is setting up. Doesn't that seem to kind of go against the whole idea of decentralization, which is supposed to be like the heart and soul of the crypto space?
Well, it definitely raises some questions. I mean, a lot of the appeal of crypto, especially in the DeFi space, is about cutting out the middlemen, right? It's about getting rid of those traditional gatekeepers like banks and central authorities. So creating a banking advisory council does seem like maybe a step back toward the very structures that DeFi is trying to disrupt.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if they can really bridge that gap between traditional finance and the core principles of Web3.
Yeah, and it also might alienate some of those early adopters and the people who really believe in the original vision of EOS as this decentralized platform.
Okay, so the road ahead for Vaulta could be a little bit bumpy. It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Definitely.
All right, sticking with the theme of crypto adoption for a minute. There was a report that came out suggesting that the White House might be thinking about acquiring Bitcoin.
Oh, wow.
Now, that would be a pretty big deal. A nation state, especially one as powerful as the U.S., actually holding Bitcoin on its balance sheet. What's the truth to this rumor?
Well, while it's certainly an intriguing thought, the information we have suggests that this report is probably not accurate.
Okay.
It actually seems to contradict the current executive order on digital assets, which doesn't include any provision for the U.S. government to buy Bitcoin.
So more likely just like a rumor or maybe even an attempt to, pump the price a bit.
Yeah, that seems more likely. Someone trying to create some buzz.
So it doesn't seem like we'll be seeing federal level adoption of Bitcoin in the U.S. anytime soon. But what about individual states? Are we seeing any movement there?
There does seem to be more openness at the state level. The idea of individual states in the U.S. exploring Bitcoin as a potential reserve asset is gaining some traction.
Right.
And Texas, which has generally been pretty crypto-friendly, has been mentioned as a possible front-runner in this area.
So we might see this kind of state-by-state approach as a more gradual and maybe politically feasible path toward broader government adoption of crypto in the U.S.
Exactly. It shows how different levels of government can have very different perspectives on this.
Interesting. All right, let's shift our focus geographically for a bit.
Yeah.
There was some news about Pavel Durov, the CEO of Telegram, being briefly detained before being allowed to return to Dubai. Why is this relevant to the crypto world?
Well, Durov and Telegram are connected to the crypto world mainly because of the growing activity we've been seeing around the TON blockchain within the Telegram ecosystem.
Right.
All sorts of interesting applications are popping up on TON, and there's been a lot of interest, which has even driven up the price of the TON token. So when Durov was detained, it caused a bit of a dip in the token's value, but once he was released, it recovered. It really shows how sensitive the market is to news involving key figures in the crypto space.
Yeah. And speaking of key figures, Durov's choice of Dubai as his base of operations is interesting. What does that tell us about where things might be heading?
Well, Dubai and the UAE more broadly have really been positioning themselves as a hub for innovation, particularly in tech and digital assets. They're trying to create a regulatory environment that's attractive to companies like Telegram. So Durov being there suggests that maybe we're seeing a shift in the global landscape.
Right. It's not just Silicon Valley anymore.
Exactly. Key players are looking for jurisdictions that offer a balance of, regulatory clarity and political stability.
Makes sense. Now, let's move away from crypto for a moment and talk about some other developments in the tech world. Specifically, it seems like the UAE is making some really big moves in artificial intelligence. The investments we're seeing are pretty mind-blowing.
No, yeah. They've announced a massive global AI infrastructure partnership. We're talking about $180 billion here, involving some major players like BlackRock, Microsoft, MGX, which is based in Abu Dhabi, and NVIDIA.
$180 billion.
Yeah.
That's a serious commitment.
It is, and it was reportedly even discussed at the White House, so it seems like there's a pretty significant level of collaboration happening between the UAE and the U.S. in this sector.
So that's huge. Wait, there's more, right? It didn't stop there.
No, not at all. Shortly after that, there was another announcement. This time it was a $20 billion investment in AI from an investment firm in Abu Dhabi.
So $20 billion on top of the $180 billion.
Yeah, it seems like Abu Dhabi is really serious about becoming a global hub for AI. It's something that Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, actually predicted earlier this year.
Well, they certainly have the resources to make it happen. And it's interesting to see these huge investments flowing into AI, especially compared to, the pace of development in the blockchain space beyond cryptocurrency. It makes you wonder if AI is going to be the next big technological wave.
Yeah, it does seem like AI is gaining a lot of momentum right now.
Okay, last but not least, you sent us some information about the release of the JFK and Epstein files. Now, this might seem a little bit out of left field, but could this have any relevance to the crypto world, even indirectly?
Well, it's definitely interesting to see these files resurface, especially the JFK files. And the way some of them were released, giving early access to certain individuals has sparked a lot of controversy. People are questioning the transparency of the whole thing.
Right.
And while it's hard to say definitively whether this will have a direct impact on the price of Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, it does feed into this broader narrative of distrust in established institutions. When people see this kind of thing, it can make them more open to the idea of decentralized systems like blockchain, which, at least in theory, offer more transparency and control over information.
And the Epstein files, too, with all the potential implications and connections to powerful people. It just adds to this sense that maybe things aren't always as they seem, So even if there's no direct link, these kinds of events can create a climate where the ideas behind crypto become more appealing to some people.
Yeah, that's definitely possible.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. What are your main takeaways? So we've talked about central banks, the future of EOs, AI, historical mysteries. It's a lot to process.
It is. I think the key themes that stand out for me are, first, the power of central bank pronouncements. They still have a huge impact on the crypto market, but we need to be really careful about the data they're using to make these decisions. Second, the evolution of projects like EOS. They're moving toward more traditional financial models, which raises questions about the future of Web3. And then there's the rise of AI. The investments we're seeing are massive, and it looks like it could reshape the technological landscape in a big way. Finally, those historical files remind us that trust in institutions is fragile, and that transparency is really important.
Yeah, I agree. Those are all really important points. What about you? What stands out to you the most from all of this? I mean, does knowing about the tiny sample size used by the Fed change how you view economic indicators? And what are your thoughts on EOS and its new direction?
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? And what about these huge investments in AI? How do you think they'll shape the world in the years to come? These are all things we need to consider as we try to make sense of what's happening around us.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that we've really just scratched the surface here. Each of these topics is incredibly complex and deserves further exploration. So if something piqued your interest, go out and do some more research. If you're curious about the Austrian School of Economics, dive in. If you want to understand Web3 banking platforms better, look into it. Or if the ethics of AI development are on your mind, there are tons of resources out there.
Right. And it's important to think about how these things are all connected. How might central bank policies affect AI investments? Could the way historical events are handled impact trust in new technologies? The world is incredibly interconnected, and understanding these connections is key to navigating the future.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to chew on.
We have.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. Until next time, keep those minds curious.
Keep exploring.